Solomon Kearney is on his knees on the shoulder of Route 29, hands locked behind his head. 6 patrol cars form a wall around his truck. Officers he has trained officers who have served under his command stand with weapons drawn barrels aimed at his chest. Blood drips from a gash above his left eye where his face was forced into asphalt. Then a sound fills the sky that every officer recognizes. Rotors. 5 SWAT helicopters crest the ridge descending fast, and everything on this roadside changes. 36 hours before his face hit the pavement, Solomon Kearney stood inside a concrete training facility on the eastern edge of Braddock County, Virginia, watching 12 operators breach a reinforced steel door in under 4 seconds. The hinges blew inward. The flashbang cracked the air white. His team swept the room in pairs, clearing corners, neutralizing simulated threats, calling out positions with voices that punched through the ringing echo like clockwork. Solomon watched every movement through the observation window, above his arms, folded across his chest. His jaw set, his dark brown eyes tracking each operator the way a conductor watches an orchestra. 20 years on the force had taught him to see everything. Every angle, every hesitation, every fraction of a second that separates a clean breach from a body bag. His stopwatch read 3.7 seconds. He pressed the button to stop it and allowed himself a single nod. 3.7 was exceptional. His SWAT unit was the finest tactical team in all of Northern Virginia, and everyone in law enforcement within 100 miles of Washington, D.C. knew it. Standing at his right shoulder was Lieutenant Calvin Dupree, 38 years old, a former Marine who had done 3 combat tours before trading desert sand for a badge and body armor. Dupree was Solomon's second-in-command, his operational mirror, a man who could finish Solomon's tactical sentences before Solomon spoke them. Their bond was forged in hundreds of high-risk entries, hostage rescues, barricade standoffs, and long nights spent debriefing operations that could have ended in death, but never did, because Solomon Kearney did not allow failure. The unit was diverse in background and experience. White, Black, Latino men and women, former military and career law enforcement. But what unified them was something that went deeper than any surface distinction. They trusted Solomon Kearney with their lives, not because of his rank, because of who he was in the moments when trust was the only thing standing between survival and disaster. After the exercise, the operators gathered in the briefing room for a debrief. Solomon spoke to them calmly, pointing out 2 timing gaps in the left corridor approach and a communication delay between the second and third pairs entering the room. His voice carried quiet authority. He did not shout. He did not need to. He corrected with precision and praised with meaning. When he said, "Outstanding," every operator in the room felt it in their chest. After the team was dismissed, Solomon stepped into his office and sat behind his desk. The room was spare and organized. Commendation plaques lined one wall. A photograph of his wife Naomi and their 2 children sat on the corner of his desk. He was reviewing the exercise log when his desk phone rang. The call came from Sheriff Philip Mabry's office. Mabry's assistant informed Solomon that the sheriff was officially recommending him for promotion to the position of Assistant Chief of the Braddock County Sheriff's Department. Solomon set the phone down after the call ended and sat perfectly still for a long moment. 20 years. 20 years of running toward gunfire when every instinct screamed to run the other direction. 20 years of proving himself to people who questioned whether a black man from a rough neighborhood in southeast D.C. had any business leading a tactical unit. 20 years of being the first to arrive and the last to leave, of carrying the weight of every operation on his shoulders without complaint of watching less qualified men get promoted above him, and saying nothing because his record would eventually speak louder than their connections. And now it had. Assistant Chief. The highest-ranking black law enforcement officer in the entire history of Braddock County. He allowed himself to feel it for just a moment. The pride, the vindication, the quiet satisfaction of a battle fought with patience and excellence. Then he locked it away and stood up to leave. As Solomon walked down the corridor toward the parking lot, he encountered Deputy Chief Gerald Kingsley coming from the opposite direction. Kingsley was 56 years old, white, tall, lean, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes the color of winter slate. He wore his uniform the way some men wear armor, every crease deliberate, every pin polished, every thread a statement of power. Kingsley extended his hand and offered a thin smile. "Congratulations, Solomon. Well deserved." Solomon shook the hand. The grip was too tight. The fingers lingered half a second too long. The smile reached nowhere near Kingsley's eyes, which remained flat and measuring like a man calculating the cost of something he was about to destroy. Solomon thanked him and continued walking, nude. But as he pushed through the exit door and stepped into the late afternoon sun, he glanced back through the glass. Kingsley was standing in the corridor with his phone already pressed to his ear. His free hand was clenched into a fist at his side. His jaw moved rapidly. His posture had shifted from the casual authority of a senior officer to the coiled intensity of a man giving orders. Solomon could not hear the words. He did not need to. He had spent 2 decades reading body language in life-or-death situations. He knew what urgency looked like. He knew what anger looked like. And he knew standing there in the fading sunlight with the weight of a new title, not yet 40 minutes old, that Gerald Kingsley was not making a phone call of congratulations. He was making a call of war. Solomon felt a chill settle at the base of his spine as he walked to his truck. This promotion had just painted a target on his back. That evening, Solomon pulled his pickup truck into the driveway of the 2-story colonial home he shared with his family in a quiet suburb 12 miles west of the county seat. The porch light was on. The lawn was freshly cut. The normalcy of it felt almost surreal after the cold electricity of his encounter with Kingsley. Inside the house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary. His daughter, 11 years old, was sprawled across the living room rug with a math textbook. His son, 8, was building something elaborate and unstable out of wooden blocks on the kitchen table. Naomi stood at the counter slicing tomatoes, her dark hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She looked up when Solomon walked in, and her eyes found his face the way they always did, searching first for damage, then for truth. She had been married to a SWAT commander long enough to know that the dangers of the job did not always arrive through a door in the middle of the night. Sometimes they arrived through a handshake in a corridor. Solomon told her about the promotion. Naomi set down the knife and looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled, and the smile was real, full of pride and love, and something else he recognized because he had seen it in her courtroom face 100 times. Caution. "You have earned this 10 times over," she said, "but you know what happens next." He did. Naomi Kearney, born Naomi Hurd, was a civil rights attorney with one of the most respected firms in the D.C. metropolitan area. She had spent 15 years representing Black professionals, law enforcement officers, educators, and public servants who had been targeted, passed over, demoted, or destroyed by institutional systems that could not tolerate their success. She knew the playbook better than anyone. The playbook was simple. When a Black man rises high enough to threaten the established order, the order does not congratulate him. It studies him. It finds a crack, real or invented, and it drives a wedge into that crack until the man splits apart. They ate dinner as a family. Solomon watched his children laugh at something on a screen, while Naomi's hand rested on his forearm beneath the table. He thought about what this promotion meant for them. Not the title, not the salary, the symbol. A Black man running tactical operations at the highest level in a county that had never seen it. His children watching their father walk through a door that had been locked for generations. He thought about his own father, a construction laborer who worked 14-hour days pouring concrete in the Virginia heat until his knees gave out at 52. His father had told him once that the hardest part of being a black man in America was not the obstacles. It was the loneliness of climbing while everyone around you pretended the ladder was the same height for everyone. After the children were asleep, Solomon sat in the living room with the lights dimmed. His phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but had not expected. Darren Stokes. Stokes was 29 years old, a black patrol officer with 3 years on the force. Solomon knew him from departmental functions and from the mentorship program Solomon had quietly established for young officers of color. Stokes was smart, dedicated, and ambitious. But when Solomon answered the call, the voice on the other end was none of those things. It was frightened. Stokes spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other like stones down a hill. He told Solomon that something deeply wrong was happening inside the department. Black officers were being assigned to solo patrols in the county's most violent zones without adequate backup. When they filed complaints, the complaints vanished from the internal system. 3 black officers had been forced out of the department in the past 12 months, each one through internal affairs investigations that materialized out of thin air, built on evidence that appeared fabricated and signed off by supervisors who refused to discuss the cases. Stokes had been quietly tracking the pattern for months, afraid to say anything, afraid that speaking up would make him the next name on the list. Solomon's hand tightened around the phone. He asked Stokes when this started. Stokes answered immediately. Roughly 18 months ago. Solomon closed his eyes. 18 months ago was exactly when Gerald Kingsley was promoted to deputy chief. This was not about one promotion. This was not about one man's jealousy. Gerald Kingsley was running a systematic purge of black officers from the Braddock County Sheriff's Department. And Solomon Kearney, the most visible and most decorated black officer in the county, had just risen high enough to become the ultimate target. Solomon did not sleep that night. He sat at the desk in his home office with the door closed, pulling records, cross-referencing dates, writing down names. Every officer Stokes had mentioned, every transfer, every sudden resignation, every internal affairs case that had opened and closed with suspicious speed. By dawn, he had assembled a folder of documentation, not enough to prove everything, but enough to show a pattern that no honest person could ignore. He called County Board Supervisor Reginald Pendergrass at 7 in the morning. Pendergrass was 52, a veteran political figure in Braddock County, and one of the few elected officials Solomon trusted. Pendergrass agreed to a private meeting that afternoon at his office in the county administrative building. Solomon would bring the folder. He would present the evidence, and together they would decide how to move forward. Solomon showered, dressed in civilian clothes, kissed Naomi on the forehead, and climbed into his personal pickup truck. No uniform, no badge visible, no marked vehicle. He was off duty driving his own truck on a public road, a 44-year-old man on his way to a meeting. He merged onto Route 29, heading north. The morning traffic was light. Sun cut through the windshield in long golden bands. He drove the speed limit. His folder sat on the passenger seat, 30 pages of names, dates, and records that could unravel Gerald Kingsley's entire operation. He never made it to the meeting. The first patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror at 9:14. Then a second. Then a third. Within 60 seconds, 6 Braddock County Sheriff's Department patrol vehicles had materialized from side roads and highway on-ramps converging on his truck with coordinated precision that Solomon recognized instantly. This was not a routine traffic stop. This was a tactical vehicle intercept, the same maneuver used to stop armed fugitives, terrorism suspects, and high-value targets fleeing active crime scenes. The cars boxed him in from every angle, lights flashing, sirens screaming. 2 vehicles cut in front of him, forcing him to brake hard. His truck skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder. Officers poured out of their vehicles with weapons drawn, handguns, shotguns. Solomon counted 8 officers, all of them moving with the rigid choreography of men who had been briefed in advance. They were shouting commands, overlapping each other, creating a wall of noise designed to overwhelm and disorient. "Driver, show your hands. Do not move. Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where we can see them." Solomon kept his palms flat against the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, completely visible. He spoke through the open window in the calm, measured voice he used during tactical operations, when lives depended on clarity. "My name is Commander Solomon Kearney, Braddock County Sheriff's Department, SWAT. Badge number 4721. I am unarmed. My credentials are in the glove compartment." They ignored him. Every word. They screamed louder. He repeated himself. They screamed again. One officer yanked open the driver's door. 2 more grabbed him by the arms and hauled him out of the truck. Solomon did not resist. He had trained officers on this very procedure. He knew that resistance, even the flinch of a single muscle, could be interpreted as a threat, could be the last thing a black man ever did on a roadside in America. They forced him face down onto the asphalt. His left cheekbone struck the pavement with a crack that sent white light exploding behind his eyes. He felt the skin above his eyebrow split open. Warm blood ran down his face and pooled beneath his cheek. They wrenched his arms behind his back and clamped handcuffs around his wrists so tight the metal bit into his skin. And then from the ground, with blood in his eyes and gravel pressing into his jaw, Solomon saw a face he knew. Sergeant Raymond Oakes, 48 years old, white, a 15-year veteran of the department. Solomon had served alongside Oakes on dozens of operations. They had shared coffee in briefing rooms. They had stood shoulder to shoulder at the funerals of fallen officers. Oakes looked directly at Solomon. Their eyes locked. Recognition was written across Oakes's face as clearly as the badge on his chest. He knew exactly who was lying on the ground in handcuffs. And Raymond Oakes turned his head away. He said nothing. He did not speak Solomon's name. He did not confirm Solomon's identity. He simply walked to the other side of his patrol car and stood with his back to the scene. An officer keyed his radio. "Suspect in custody." Solomon heard the word and understood everything. Suspect. Not commander, not colleague, not the man who had led the most elite unit in the county for 7 years. Suspect. This stop was not random. Someone had called it in. Someone had orchestrated this. And as Solomon lay bleeding on the shoulder of Route 29, he watched the folder slide from the open door of his truck. 30 pages of evidence caught the wind and scattered across the gravel. An officer walked through them without looking down, grinding the papers under his boots as if they were leaves. 20 minutes passed. Solomon remained on his knees in the gravel, hands cuffed behind his back, blood drying in a dark line from his eyebrow to his jaw. The morning sun climbed higher and turned the asphalt into a griddle. Heat radiated up through his knees. Sweat ran down his neck and soaked the collar of his shirt. Not a single officer had made any effort to verify his identification. His department ID and his badge sat inside the glove compartment of his truck less than 6 feet from where he knelt, and no one had opened it. No one had checked. Solomon had identified himself 3 times with his full name, rank, and badge number, and each time his words had been swallowed by the deliberate chaos of shouting officers who behaved as if he had not spoken at all. The roadside had become a spectacle. Passing cars slowed and stopped. A cluster of civilians gathered on the opposite shoulder, some standing in stunned silence, others holding up cell phones with cameras rolling. Solomon could see the tiny red recording lights blinking in the morning glare. He kept his face still, his back straight, his breathing controlled. He would not give them the image of a broken man. He would give them the image of a commander. 12 miles south, at SWAT headquarters, Calvin Dupree was in the equipment bay inspecting tactical vests when his personal phone erupted with a call from a number he did not recognize. The caller was a civilian, a woman driving northbound on Route 29, who had slowed her car when she saw the convoy of patrol vehicles surrounding a pickup truck. She had recognized Solomon Kearney because her brother was a firefighter in Braddock County who had worked alongside Solomon on emergency response operations. Her voice was shaking. "They have Commander Kearney on the ground on Route 29. He is in handcuffs. There is blood on his face. There are at least 6 cars. They have guns on him." Dupree did not respond for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, every synapse in his brain fired with the cold, clear processing power of a man who had coordinated combat operations in Fallujah under mortar fire. He ended the call and moved. Within 4 minutes, 5 SWAT helicopters were spinning their rotors on the tarmac behind headquarters. 2 tactical response vehicles rolled out of the garage with full teams aboard. Dupree climbed into the lead helicopter and pulled on his headset. He radioed the other pilots with a single command: "Route 29, northbound mile marker 41. Full tactical approach. Commander Kearney is in distress. Move now." The helicopters lifted off in formation and banked hard to the north. Below them, the Virginia countryside scrolled past in a blur of green fields and gray roads. Dupree stared through the windshield with a look that would have made any sane person step aside. The sound reached the roadside before the helicopters did. A deep, rhythmic thudding that grew from a whisper to a roar in under 30 seconds. The patrol officers on the scene looked up. The civilians looked up. Solomon, still on his knees, looked up. 5 black helicopters appeared over the tree line, like a wall of thunder dropping altitude, fast rotors churning the air into a storm that shook the patrol cars on their suspensions and sent the scattered pages of Solomon's evidence folder spinning into the sky like white birds. The helicopters descended in a tactical spread, 2 flanking wide 2, holding a perimeter 1, touching down on the highway median in a tornado of dust and gravel. Before the skids settled, SWAT operators in full tactical gear fast-roped from the hovering aircraft and fanned across the roadside with weapons at the low-ready position. Dupree stepped out of the lead helicopter and walked directly toward the convoy officers. He was not running. He was walking with the controlled, measured stride of a man who wanted every officer present to see his face and understand what was about to happen. He stopped 3 feet from the nearest patrol officer and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire scene. "That man on his knees is Commander Solomon Kearney, Braddock County SWAT, badge number 4721. You will remove those handcuffs now." The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took for every patrol officer on the scene to realize the magnitude of what they had done. The handcuffs were removed. Solomon rose slowly, straightening to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches. Dupree handed him a clean cloth from his tactical vest. Solomon pressed it against the gash above his eye, without a word. The 2 men stood side by side, and every officer on that roadside understood that they were looking at something that would not end here. Within 1 hour, the footage from dashcams, body cameras, and civilian cell phones had been uploaded, shared, reposted, and broadcast across every digital platform in the country. A decorated black SWAT commander kneeling in handcuffs, bleeding, surrounded by officers from his own department, while his own tactical helicopters descended from the sky to rescue him. The video broke records for views within its first 90 minutes online. National news networks interrupted programming to show the footage. But Solomon was not watching the coverage. He was standing beside his truck looking at the ground where his folder had been. The gravel was littered with torn and scattered pages. But not all of them. Several documents were gone entirely. Key pages showing names, dates, and internal affairs. Case numbers had vanished. In the chaos of the helicopter arrival, with dust swirling and papers flying, and every eye turned to the sky, someone had collected them. The evidence Solomon was carrying to board supervisor Pendergrass had been stolen from the scene. And Solomon knew, with the certainty of a man who had been set up from the beginning, exactly who had ordered this stop. The Braddock County Sheriff's Department plunged into crisis within hours. The video was everywhere. Cable news anchors played the footage on a loop frame by frame, narrating each second of a decorated black commander being treated like a criminal by his own colleagues. Social media erupted with outrage. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding an immediate investigation. By mid-afternoon, every major news outlet in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area had camera crews parked outside department headquarters. Sheriff Philip Mabry held a press conference at 4 o'clock. He stood behind a podium flanked by department flags, his face arranged in an expression of carefully calibrated concern. Mabry was 61 years old, a career bureaucrat who had ascended to the sheriff's office not through operational excellence, but through political caution. He was a man who had spent his entire career avoiding conflict, and the conflict that had just landed on his desk was the kind that ended careers, triggered federal inquiries, and burned through political capital like wildfire. Mabry expressed deep concern over the incident. He assured the public that the department would conduct a thorough and transparent review. He praised Commander Kearney's service record, and then, with the precision of a man who had been coached extensively before stepping in front of the cameras, he stopped short of calling the stop racial profiling. He stopped short of calling it targeted. He described it as an unfortunate incident resulting from a legitimate law enforcement operation. The official story emerged within the hour. A be on the lookout bulletin had been issued earlier that morning for a black male driving a dark-colored pickup truck in connection with an armed robbery in the southern part of the county. Commander Kearney's vehicle matched the general description. The stop was a case of mistaken identity. Regrettable, but procedurally defensible. Solomon sat in his living room that evening and watched the press conference on television with the cloth still pressed to the wound above his eye. He knew every word Mabry spoke was a lie wrapped in institutional language. There had been no armed robbery reported in Braddock County that morning. Solomon had already checked the public dispatch logs before they could be altered. But when he checked again 2 hours later, the logs had changed. A robbery call now appeared in the system, time-stamped 32 minutes before his traffic stop filed from a gas station in the southern part of the county. The timestamps had been altered. The call had been fabricated. Someone with administrative access to the department's dispatch system had inserted a false record to provide retroactive justification for the convoy that stopped him. Solomon was documenting the altered records on his personal laptop when a knock came at his front door. It was 11:15 at night. Naomi looked at him from the hallway, her eyes sharp with concern. Solomon checked the security camera on his phone. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light, was Sergeant Raymond Oakes. The man who had stood on Route 29 that morning looked directly at Solomon in handcuffs and turned away without a word. Solomon opened the door. Oakes looked like he had not stopped trembling since morning. His face was pale. His hands were jammed into the pockets of his jacket to keep them from shaking. He could not make eye contact for the first several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice came out cracked and dry. He told Solomon everything. Deputy Chief Gerald Kingsley had personally ordered the convoy stop. Kingsley had called a group of patrol officers into his office at 7:30 that morning, before Solomon had even left his house, and told them that Commander Kearney was the subject of a classified internal corruption investigation. Kingsley told them Solomon had stolen sensitive department files and was attempting to leave the county with the stolen evidence. The officers in the convoy believed they were apprehending a dirty cop who was fleeing with classified material. They did not know they were stopping their own SWAT commander on a fabricated pretext. Oakes said he had recognized Solomon the moment he saw him on the ground. He said the shame of his silence had been eating through him all day like acid. But he was afraid. Kingsley had the power to end any officer's career with a single phone call. Oakes had a wife and 3 children. He could not afford to lose his job, his pension, his entire life. Then Oakes delivered the piece of information that turned Solomon's blood to ice. "He has done this before. You are not the first. The last one did not make it." Oakes was talking about Captain Jerome Hendry. Hendry was a black officer who had served the department for 18 years before being forced out 3 years ago through an internal affairs investigation that appeared from nowhere. 6 months after his forced resignation, Jerome Hendry was found dead in his home. The official ruling was suicide. Oakes said that no one in the department believed it. He said Hendry had been fighting back, gathering evidence, threatening to go public. And then Hendry was gone. Solomon stood in his doorway and felt the weight of those words settle onto his shoulders like a stone slab. This was not a battle for a promotion. This was a battle for survival. Solomon Kearney had spent 20 years breaching doors, neutralizing armed threats, and making decisions that had determined whether people lived or died. He had never once hesitated in the field. He did not hesitate now. The morning after Oakes's visit, Solomon sat at the kitchen table across from Naomi and laid out everything. The stop, the fabricated bolo, Kingsley's direct order to the convoy, the altered dispatch records, the pattern of black officers being purged from the department, and Jerome Hendry. Naomi listened with the stillness of a woman who had spent her career in courtrooms where a single misplaced word could collapse an entire case. When Solomon finished, she reached across the table and placed both of her hands over his. "We build a federal case," she said. "Civil rights violations, conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law. We take this above the county. We take this to the Department of Justice." Solomon reached out to Camille Greer, an investigative journalist with one of the largest regional newspapers in Northern Virginia. Greer was 34, tenacious, fearless, and had built her reputation on exposing institutional corruption. Solomon met her in a parking garage on the outskirts of the county seat and gave her everything he had. Every name, every date, every detail Oakes had shared. The pattern of forced resignations, the fabricated investigation files, the death of Jerome Hendry. Greer's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages Solomon handed her. She told him she would begin investigating immediately. Solomon warned her that Kingsley was powerful and connected. Greer looked at him and said, "So am I." The counterattack came faster and harder than Solomon anticipated. Within 48 hours of the roadside incident, Solomon received a formal notice from the department's Office of Professional Standards. He was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into whether he had misused SWAT resources by authorizing the helicopter mobilization on Route 29. The investigation alleged that Solomon had activated a tactical response team for personal reasons rather than a legitimate operational purpose. His security clearance was revoked, his access to SWAT headquarters was suspended, his personnel file, which had been flawless for 20 years, was suddenly populated with complaint reports he had never seen. Reports bearing dates stretching back years, filed by officers he had never had a single conflict with, alleging misconduct, insubordination, and misuse of authority. The documents were fabricated. Solomon recognized the formatting inconsistencies, the language that did not match departmental norms, the signatures that appeared copied rather than original. But the reports were in his file stamped with official dates, and they would carry the weight of institutional authority in any administrative proceeding. Then the intimidation crossed a line that turned Solomon's discipline into something far more dangerous. On a Tuesday afternoon, his daughter came home from school and told Naomi that a dark car had followed her school bus for the last 3 blocks. On Wednesday, his son reported the same thing. a dark sedan with tinted windows idling at the corner near the school entrance, then pulling away slowly when the children walked inside. Solomon reported the incidents to the department. Nothing was done. No patrol car was assigned to the area. No investigation was opened. The reports were filed and forgotten with the speed of something that was designed to be ignored. On Thursday evening, Naomi arrived at her law firm to find a sealed manila envelope on her desk. No return address, no postmark. It had been hand-delivered. She opened it and felt her hands go numb. Inside was a single photograph. Their 2 children on the school playground, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens. The image was sharp enough to show the pattern on their backpacks. There was no note. No words were necessary. The message was absolute. Back off or your children pay. Solomon stared at the photograph that night and felt something crack inside his chest. Rage flooded through him so hot and so total that for a moment he could not see clearly. Every cell in his body screamed for him to drive to Kingsley's house and make the man answer for this with something far more permanent than a court filing. But Naomi placed her hand on his arm. She held his gaze and spoke with the iron calm that made her one of the most effective attorneys in the district. They want you to react. They want you to do something that gives them justification to destroy you. We will not be broken. We fight this with the law, with evidence, with the truth. Solomon sat alone in the dark living room long after Naomi went to bed. The house was silent. His children were sleeping in their rooms, unaware that someone had photographed them through a lens designed for surveillance. A man who had spent 20 years protecting strangers could not protect his own family. And that was the cruelest wound of all. Everything Solomon had built began to collapse. The walls closed in from every direction, and each new blow landed harder than the last. Camille Greer called Solomon on a Friday morning with a voice that was tight with controlled fury. Her editor had killed the investigative story, pulled it entirely. The newspaper's ownership group had financial ties to several members of the Braddock County Board of Supervisors, and pressure had been applied through channels that Greer could not penetrate. She had been told that the story was legally problematic and insufficiently sourced, despite the fact that she had documentation on the record sources and a paper trail that would have satisfied any serious editorial standard. The real reason was transparent. The people who owned the paper could not afford to let the paper burn down the power structure that protected their interests. County Board Supervisor Reginald Pendergrass was the next domino to fall. Pendergrass received a private visit from 2 other board members who informed him in polite but unmistakable terms that his continued association with Solomon Kearney was a political liability. If he persisted, his committee assignments would be reassigned. His budget requests would be denied. His re-election campaign would find itself without the party support it needed to survive. Pendergrass was a man of principle, but he was also a man who understood the math of political survival. He withdrew his support quietly, without a phone call, without an explanation. Solomon learned about it through the silence that replaced the calls that used to come. Darren Stokes, the young officer who had first alerted Solomon to the pattern of targeting, was transferred without explanation to a remote patrol substation in the farthest corner of the county. The transfer came with a shift change that made it effectively impossible for Stokes to communicate with anyone during normal working hours. He had been exiled to a place where his voice could not be heard. And then came the worst blow of all. Raymond Oakes, the man who had come to Solomon's door trembling with the truth, formally recanted. Oakes submitted a written statement to Internal Affairs, asserting that his previous claims about Deputy Chief Kingsley were the product of stress confusion and personal difficulties. The statement was carefully worded in language that Solomon recognized as having been written by someone other than Oakes. But the signature at the bottom was real. Oakes had been broken. Fear had done what Kingsley's authority alone could not. Solomon stood alone. Every ally had been neutralized. Every source had been silenced. Every institutional pathway had been sealed shut by the same man who had orchestrated the ambush on Route 29. The internal investigation, now led by Lieutenant Garrett Lofton, under Kingsley's direct supervision, produced its findings with remarkable speed. The report concluded that Commander Kearney had engaged in misuse of department resources, and conduct unbecoming a law enforcement officer. It recommended immediate suspension without pay. Solomon was summoned to a meeting at headquarters where his badge was confiscated. His service weapon was collected. He was escorted from the building by 2 officers who avoided his eyes. The man who had commanded the most elite tactical unit in Northern Virginia walked out of the building he had entered thousands of times and stood in the parking lot with nothing in his hands. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the suspension notice. Naomi came home from her firm with a look on her face that Solomon had only seen once before, the night she won a case that everyone told her was unwinnable. She sat down across from him and opened her laptop. While building the legal case for Solomon's defense, Naomi had pulled every internal affairs file she could access through discovery requests filed in connection with a preliminary civil rights complaint. What she found was a single thread that connected every case. Lieutenant Wesley Overton. Overton was the internal affairs officer who had personally handled every single investigation into every black officer who had been forced out of the department. Every case, without exception. Each one had been opened on Kingsley's direct order. Each one had followed the same pattern: fabricated complaints, altered records, accelerated proceedings, and predetermined outcomes. And now Wesley Overton had reached out to Naomi's law firm through an anonymous back channel. He wanted to talk. Overton was 45 years old. He had spent years executing Kingsley's orders, building cases against officers he knew were innocent, manufacturing evidence against men and women whose only crime was the color of their skin. And the weight of it had finally become more than he could carry. He had been copying files for months, preserving the original unaltered dispatch records, saving the fabricated BOLO documents, archiving the forged complaint reports, recording conversations, cataloging the direct written orders from Kingsley that authorized each investigation. Wesley Overton had built the evidence vault that Gerald Kingsley never knew existed, and he was ready to open it. But he needed something first: federal immunity, witness protection, a guarantee that the system Kingsley had built could not reach him once he stepped into the light. Naomi closed her laptop and looked at Solomon. "We have him," she said. Solomon looked at his wife and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, something harder: certainty. Solomon and Naomi moved with the precision and speed of 2 people who understood that the window of opportunity would not stay open long. Kingsley's network was vast, and the moment he detected any movement against him, he would mobilize every resource at his disposal to shut it down. They could not afford a single wasted hour. Naomi contacted a former colleague at the Department of Justice who specialized in federal civil rights enforcement. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end of the call, the colleague had agreed to escalate the matter to the Civil Rights Division. Within 72 hours, a federal civil rights investigation was opened under seal, meaning Kingsley and his allies would receive no notification, no warning, no chance to prepare. Federal agents met with Wesley Overton at a secure location outside of Braddock County. Overton arrived carrying 2 hard drives and 4 sealed boxes of printed documents. He sat across from 3 FBI agents and a federal prosecutor and spoke for 6 hours without interruption. What he delivered was devastating. Years of meticulously preserved records documenting every fabricated investigation Kingsley had ordered. Original dispatch logs that showed no robbery report existed on the morning of Solomon's traffic stop, directly contradicting the altered records in the department's system. the fabricated bolo used to justify the convoy, forged complaint reports inserted into the personnel files of targeted officers, internal emails from Kingsley directing Overton to open investigations with specific predetermined outcomes, and recordings. Overton had worn a recording device during 3 separate meetings with Kingsley over the preceding 4 months. On those recordings, Kingsley's voice was unmistakable. He discussed targeting specific black officers by name. He gave explicit instructions on how to fabricate evidence that would survive administrative review. He referred to Solomon Kearney as a problem that should have been handled a long time ago. He made a reference to Jerome Hendry that stopped just short of a direct confession, but left no ambiguity about his role in Hendry's destruction. The evidence was massive and airtight. Kingsley had not just targeted Solomon. He had designed and operated a systematic, years-long campaign to identify, isolate, and eliminate black officers from the Braddock County Sheriff's Department. He had weaponized internal affairs, corrupted dispatch records, fabricated criminal referrals, intimidated witnesses, and created a culture of fear so pervasive that officers who knew the truth were terrified to speak it. Solomon reached out to the black officers who had been forced out of the department. One by one, they agreed to testify before a federal grand jury. Men and women who had been silenced, humiliated, stripped of their careers and their dignity stepped forward because someone was finally offering them the one thing the system had denied them, a chance to be heard. Darren Stokes was brought back from his exile in the county's far reaches. He testified with the quiet fury of a young officer who had watched the institution he believed in betray everything it claimed to stand for. Raymond Oakes, strengthened by the knowledge that federal protection now existed and that Kingsley's power was about to end, found his courage. He reaffirmed every word of his original statement about Kingsley ordering the convoy stop. He testified with tears running down his face, describing the shame of watching Solomon bleed on the roadside and saying nothing. Camille Greer took her investigative story to a national news outlet that could not be pressured by county politics. The story ran as a front-page exclusive, accompanied by photographs, documents, and detailed accounts from multiple sources. It dominated the national news cycle for 3 consecutive days. The federal grand jury returned a sealed indictment. Arrest warrants were issued, and then Kingsley ran. Someone inside the system tipped him off. The leak was never identified, but it gave Kingsley a head start of approximately 90 minutes. He drove to a private airstrip 35 miles outside the county, where a chartered turboprop airplane was fueled and waiting on the tarmac. Kingsley had planned for this possibility. He had money. He had connections. He had a destination where he believed he could disappear. Calvin Dupree received the call from the FBI at 9:47 in the evening. The message was brief. Kingsley was fleeing. His location had been tracked to the private airstrip. Federal agents were en route, but Dupree's SWAT team was closer. Dupree did not need to be asked twice. Within minutes, the same 5 helicopters that had descended on Route 29 to rescue Solomon Kearney were airborne again. But this time, they were not flying to protect. They were flying to capture. The helicopters reached the airstrip in 11 minutes. Dupree could see the plane on the tarmac, its propellers already turning, its navigation lights blinking in the darkness. A figure was climbing the boarding stairs. Kingsley. The helicopters dropped into a tactical cordon around the airstrip, their searchlights blazing white columns into the night. SWAT operators deployed across the runway, cutting off every exit. Dupree landed the lead helicopter directly in the path of the aircraft's taxi route. He stepped out onto the concrete with his tactical vest secured and his face lit by the glare of the searchlights. Kingsley froze on the stairs. For a moment, the deputy chief of the Braddock County Sheriff's Department stood silhouetted against the doorway of the plane, staring down at the wall of tactical operators that had materialized between him and escape. Then he turned and tried to retreat into the cabin. 2 SWAT operators reached the stairs before Kingsley could take a second step. They pulled him from the boarding stairs, brought him down to the tarmac, and placed him face down on the concrete. His arms were wrenched behind his back. Handcuffs were locked around his wrists. The same cold metal, the same unyielding grip, the same posture of powerlessness that Solomon Kearney had endured on the shoulder of Route 29. Dupree walked over and stood above Kingsley. He looked down at the man who had tried to destroy his commander, his colleagues, and his unit. He leaned close enough for only Kingsley to hear. "Commander Kearney sends his regards." The aftermath moved like a wave that could not be stopped once it began. Gerald Kingsley was indicted on 14 federal charges, including civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights under color of law, obstruction of justice evidence, tampering witness intimidation, and making false statements to federal investigators. Each charge carried the weight of years of documented systematic abuse. Sheriff Philip Mabry submitted his resignation before the ink on Kingsley's indictment was dry. He released a 3-sentence statement that expressed no remorse, accepted no responsibility, and acknowledged nothing. He simply stepped aside and disappeared from public life, a man whose legacy would forever be defined by the crimes he allowed to happen under his command because he lacked the courage to confront them. The investigation into Captain Jerome Hendry's death was officially reopened. Federal investigators reclassified the case from a closed suicide to an active investigation into potential homicide. Hendry's family, who had spent 3 years living with the anguish of unanswered questions, was contacted by the FBI and informed that their loved one's death would finally receive the scrutiny it deserved. Solomon Kearney was reinstated with full honors. Every fabricated complaint was expunged from his personnel file. His badge was returned. His service weapon was returned. And then the county board did something that had never been done in the history of Braddock County. They did not simply promote Solomon to assistant chief. They appointed him acting sheriff. On his first morning in the office that had belonged to Philip Mabry, Solomon sat behind the desk and placed the photograph of Naomi and their children in the same spot it had occupied on his old desk at SWAT headquarters. Calvin Dupree knocked on the open door, walked in, and set a polished badge on the desk in front of him. The badge caught the morning light and sent a small, bright reflection across the ceiling. Solomon looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up and called a press conference. The briefing room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters from every major network in the country filled every seat and lined the walls. Camera operators jostled for position. Microphones bristled from the podium like a steel forest. Everyone expected a victory speech, a celebration, a triumphant moment for a man who had fought the system and won. Solomon stepped to the podium and did none of those things. He unfolded a single piece of paper and began to read names. He read the name of every black officer who had been forced out of the Braddock County Sheriff's Department under Gerald Kingsley's campaign. He read their badge numbers. He read their years of service. He read in simple and unadorned language what had been done to each of them. He did not rush. He did not editorialize. He let the names and the facts carry their own weight. When he reached the final name on the list, he paused. Then he said the name of Captain Jerome Hendry. He read Hendry's badge number. He read his 18 years of service. He described how Hendry had been driven out of the department through a fabricated investigation and how Hendry had died 6 months later under circumstances that were now the subject of a federal homicide inquiry. Then Solomon asked the room for a moment of silence, and the room gave it. For 30 seconds, not a camera shutter clicked, not a reporter spoke, not a breath was audible. The silence held the weight of every injustice that had been buried, ignored, and denied within the walls of this institution. When the silence ended, Solomon held up his badge. He turned it so the cameras could see it clearly. And then he spoke the words that would be replayed on every screen in the country for weeks to come. This badge nearly killed me, not because of what it is, but because of what was allowed to hide behind it. The system that this badge represents was engineered to crush people who look like me, to silence us, to erase us. And wearing this badge means nothing, absolutely nothing, unless the institution behind it is rebuilt from its foundation. He announced the creation of a civilian oversight board with independent authority to review all internal affairs investigations. He announced new hiring and promotion protocols designed to prevent the kind of systematic exclusion Kingsley had perfected. He announced mandatory training on discrimination, accountability, and the constitutional rights of every officer regardless of race. He announced the appointment of an independent review panel to audit every personnel action taken under Kingsley's tenure. And he announced the establishment of a permanent memorial inside department headquarters bearing the name of every officer the department had failed. Solomon folded the piece of paper, placed it in his breast pocket, and stepped away from the podium. He walked out of the briefing room into the afternoon light. The sun was warm on his face. The lawn in front of headquarters was green and wide, bordered by oak trees whose leaves turned gently in the breeze. Naomi stood on the sidewalk with their 2 children. The moment the children saw their father, they broke free from her hands and sprinted across the grass. Solomon dropped to one knee and caught them both, one in each arm, pulling them against his chest so tightly that for a moment the world contained nothing else. Naomi walked over and placed her hand on his shoulder. Above them 5 helicopters passed in tight formation across the blue Virginia sky. Not in rescue, not in pursuit, in salute. The shadow of their rotors swept across the lawn like a benediction, and then they were gone, climbing into the high, clear air, until the sound of their engines faded into silence. The story of Solomon Kearney did not end that afternoon on the lawn. It began there. Because the badge does not make the man. The man remakes the badge. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many people are wearing badges, titles, and positions of authority right now and using that power not to protect, but to destroy. Think about the Solomon Kearneys who are still fighting, still enduring, still waiting for someone to listen. Now here is the question that matters. What would you have done if you were standing on that roadside, watching a man bleed for a crime he did not commit? Would you have spoken up, or would you have turned away? Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation needs every voice it can get. If this story moved you, hit that like button so more people can find it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that needs to be told. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Because stories like this do not change the world by sitting in silence. They change the world when they are passed from one person to the next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring enough to stay until the end. May you carry the courage of Solomon Kearney with you, and may you never look away when the truth needs a witness.